Would you judge a man by his clothes? This manager did, and it cost him everything. The showroom gleamed with opulence. Spotless white marble stretched endlessly. Glass walls reflected the brilliance of the overhead lights, and sleek luxury sports cars stood in perfect rows like untouchable masterpieces. It was the kind of place where the wealthy dropped absurd amounts of money without a second thought. And then, there was Clarence. He pushed open the heavy glass door, and the air shifted almost instantly. His boots, caked in dried mud from hours on the farm, left faint marks on the pristine floor. The sweat-stained flannel clung to his back. His jeans, worn and frayed at the knees, bore the marks of years of hard labor. The scent of polished leather and expensive cologne filled the room. But Clarence carried something different, the crisp, earthy aroma of fresh soil and country air. He didn't belong here, or at least that's what they thought. Salesmen stole quick glances before returning to their conversations. A couple admiring an electric blue sports car paused, whispering as their eyes trailed over him. And then there was Nick Simmons. The showroom manager had been laughing at something on his phone. But the moment Clarence stepped inside, his expression hardened. His jaw tightened, lips pressing into a thin line, and his gaze swept over Clarence like he was an unwelcome guest in an exclusive club. Clarence had barely taken a few steps when Nick intercepted him. "Sir," Nick's voice oozed forced politeness. "Can I help you with something?" Unbothered, Clarence took a casual glance around. "Yeah, I heard you had the new limited edition model in stock. Wanted to take a look?" Nick exhaled a short, amused breath. His eyes flicked over Clarence's dirt-streaked clothes, calloused hands, and faded cap. "We don't exactly offer test drives to just anyone," he said, tilting his head slightly. "This isn't the kind of place where people just browse." Clarence's brow lifted slightly. "That so?" Nick folded his arms, his smirk widening. "You might have better luck across town. They've got a solid selection of used trucks." Before Clarence could respond, the glass door swung open with a soft hiss, and a rush of cool air followed. Nick didn't even turn around. His focus was locked on Clarence, as if making sure he didn't step any further. Clarence exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. He had spent years dealing with men like Nick. Different faces, same arrogance. He considered walking away, but something in him refused to back down. "I'm not looking for a used truck," Clarence said evenly. "I came here for a reason." Nick chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if he had heard it all before. "Sir, this is a luxury dealership. Our clientele is selective." The word lingered between them. A few feet away, a younger salesman, barely in his mid-20s, shifted uncomfortably. Dressed in a sharp suit, he glanced between Clarence and Nick, sensing the tension thickening in the air. The younger salesman hesitated, as if debating whether to step in, but ultimately stayed silent. Clarence adjusted his cap, locking eyes with Nick. "Selective, huh?" Nick's smirk remained unchanged. "That's right." The tension in the showroom thickened, stretching like an invisible rope pulled taut. A woman inspecting a silver sports car with her husband stole a quick glance before turning away, pretending she hadn't noticed. Clarence exhaled, shoving his calloused hands into his pockets. "You know," he murmured, shaking his head slightly, "I've spent my whole life building something from nothing. Funny thing about money, it doesn't always look the way you expect." Nick's expression barely shifted. If anything, he looked even more amused. "I'm sure that's true," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But our customers don't usually track dirt into the showroom." His gaze dropped to Clarence's boots before flicking back up. "So unless you're here for something more realistic," he gestured lazily toward the exit, "I don't want to waste your time." The younger salesman shifted again. This time, he started to speak. But a sharp look from Nick silenced him before a single word could escape. Clarence let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. He had expected this. It wasn't the first time, probably wouldn't be the last. But before he could respond, a voice rang out from behind them. "Hey, Dad!" "Sorry I took so long." Nick froze mid-smirk. Slowly, he turned toward the voice. The man who had just walked in was the picture of wealth and success. Tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and a designer watch that caught the light just right. He moved with an effortless confidence, the kind that made people step aside without him even asking. "Derek?" Clarence gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "You're late." Derek chuckled, strolling toward him. "Yeah, got caught up with some last-minute calls." He clapped Clarence on the shoulder with an easy familiarity, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then, his sharp gaze shifted to Nick. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by something else entirely. Panic. Nick blinked rapidly, his mouth slightly open as his brain scrambled to process what he had just witnessed. His eyes darted between Clarence and Derek, desperately searching for a mistake, a misunderstanding. Clarence, the man he had just dismissed as some nobody who didn't belong, was Derek's father. Derek's expression darkened slightly as he glanced between them. "I see you've already met my dad." His tone was casual, but there was a dangerous edge creeping in. Nick opened his mouth, but no words came. Nearby, the younger salesman, who had been watching with increasing discomfort, suddenly found a reason to focus on his clipboard, avoiding eye contact altogether. A heavy silence settled over the showroom, stretching unbearably. A few customers, sensing something significant was unfolding, subtly repositioned themselves to listen in. Nick finally found his voice, but it came out weak. I didn't realize." Derek tilted his head slightly. "Didn't realize what, exactly?" Nick swallowed hard. "I mean, I didn't know he was—" Derek cut him off, his tone cold. "Rich?" Nick flinched. Clarence remained silent, watching. Derek stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "So let me get this straight," he said, as if piecing it together in real time. "You saw a black man walk in here wearing work clothes, and instead of treating him like a paying customer, you decided he didn't belong?" Nick's mouth opened, then snapped shut just as quickly. His carefully crafted confidence had completely crumbled. Derek let the silence stretch before turning to his father. "Did he even let you see the car?" Clarence shook his head. "Didn't get that far." Derek exhaled sharply, turning back to Nick, something close to disgust flickering in his eyes. "This is interesting," he mused, "because I was planning to buy 3 cars today, Cash." A soft gasp came from someone in the background. Even the employees who had been pretending not to notice stiffened. Nick's face lost all color. Derek adjusted his cuff, eyes still locked onto Nick's. "But now, I think I'll take my business elsewhere." Nick visibly jolted, as if someone had kicked the back of his knees. "Wait, Mr. Carter, Derek held up a hand, cutting him off coldly. "No, you had your chance." Nick's panicked gaze darted around, searching for someone to back him up, but the younger salesman had suddenly become engrossed in a price tag. The other employees? They knew better than to get involved. Clarence smirked slightly, adjusting his cap. "Guess we're getting those cars somewhere else, huh?" Derek nodded. "Yeah, somewhere that actually deserves our money." Together they turned toward the door, but Nick wasn't done yet. His breath hitched, his mind racing. He had to fix this, fast. "Wait," he blurted, stepping forward. "Mr. Carter, please, let's talk about this." The arrogance was gone. Desperation had taken its place. Derek didn't even slow down. Clarence, however, paused just before reaching the exit. He turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Talk about what, exactly?" Nick hurried to close the gap, forcing an awkward, ingratiating smile. "This was a misunderstanding," he said, his voice suddenly laced with fake warmth. "I had no idea you were family," Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "Family?" He turned fully to face Nick, crossing his arms. "So if he wasn't my father, you'd still be throwing him out?" Nick froze. Derek let the silence drag. "See, that's the problem," Derek continued, stepping closer. "You don't respect people, you respect money, and if you don't see money on someone, you act like they don't matter." Nick's face turned red. His fingers twitched at his sides. "That's not what I meant." Derek wasn't interested in excuses. "So tell me, Nick, how long have you been doing this? How many people have you turned away just because they didn't look rich enough?" Nick opened his mouth, then shut it again. The air in the showroom was thick. Employees had stopped pretending to work. Customers stood frozen, some pretending to scroll through their phones, but all watching. While eavesdropping, Clarence watched Nick carefully, noting the panic settling in his eyes. He had seen men like this before, self-appointed gatekeepers deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. Clarence shook his head. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've been in places like this before. Restaurants, hotels, dealerships. I've seen that same look you gave me 100 times. He let the words settle before adding, "Funny thing, though. The same people who turn their noses up at me always change their tune once they realize what's in my bank account." Nick swallowed hard, sweat gathering at his temple. Derek stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment sting. "Here's what's going to happen, Nick," he said. "You're going to watch us walk out that door, and you're going to remember this moment the next time you judge someone by their clothes instead of their character." Nick's desperate gaze flicked to Clarence. "Sir, please, But Clarence had already turned away. And just like that, the biggest sale of Nick's career walked right out the door. But the consequences were just getting started. The heavy glass door swung shut behind Clarence and Derek, leaving behind a silence so thick it might as well have been concrete. Inside the showroom, Nick stood frozen, his face twisted in an awkward half-smile, half-grimace, like his brain hadn't caught up to what had just happened. The younger salesman, who had been watching everything unfold with barely concealed discomfort, finally exhaled and muttered, "Wow." A few other employees exchanged glances. They had seen Nick act this way before. Maybe not this blatantly, but the arrogance, the subtle exclusions, the way he catered to certain customers while dismissing others. It wasn't new. But this time? This time he had embarrassed himself publicly. And worse, he had just lost the kind of sale that could have earned them all serious commissions. A woman who had been admiring a sleek red convertible turned to her husband and whispered, "Did that just happen?" The man, still staring at the exit, shook his head. "Yeah, and I don't think I want to buy from here anymore." Nick finally snapped out of it, his head whipping toward the younger salesman. "Why didn't you say something?" he hissed, like this was somehow someone else's fault. The younger man blinked. "What was I supposed to do? Tell you not to be a jerk?" Nick's jaw clenched. He spun toward the front desk, grabbing his phone. He had to fix this. He'd call Derek Carter's office, apologize, offer a discount. Something. But before he could even unlock the screen, the dealership's regional manager, Mr. Reynolds, walked in. And from the look on his face, he had seen everything. Nick stiffened, his stomach twisting into knots. "Sir, Reynolds held up a hand. "Save it," he said. "My office now." Nick's stomach plummeted. Reynolds turned and walked toward his office. Every single pair of eyes in the showroom stayed locked on Nick. The customers, the salespeople, even the receptionist had stopped typing. Nick swallowed hard. He had been in this industry long enough to know. He wasn't walking out of that office with his job. But what about Clarence and Derek? Their day wasn't over yet. Outside, Clarence and Derek stepped into the afternoon sun. the tension from inside the showroom rolling off their shoulders like dust shaken from old boots. Derek pulled out his keys, unlocking the doors to his sleek black SUV. He paused, glancing at his father. "You all right?" Clarence let out a slow breath, then smirked. "You know, I've been disrespected before," he said, "but watching that man's face when he realized who I was? That was something else." Derek chuckled, shaking his head. "You handled that better than I would have." Clarence tilted his head. "Oh, I don't know. You did pretty well putting him in his place." He slid into the passenger seat, adjusting his cap. "I'm guessing he won't be working there much longer." Derek started the engine, the soft hum of the car filling the silence. "That's not really the point, though," he said. "Firing one guy doesn't fix the problem. There are 100 more just like him, thinking they can size people up based on their clothes, their accent, their skin." Clarence nodded slowly, rubbing his palms together. "Yeah. But people like that? They always expose themselves. The world has a way of humbling a man who thinks he's above others." Derek pulled out of the parking lot, his grip firm on the wheel. "Still, I don't like seeing you treated that way." Clarence gave him a knowing glance. "Son, I've been treated that way long before you were even born." Derek exhaled sharply. He hated that, hated how normal this was for his father. They drove in silence for a moment, the city rolling past in a blur. Then Clarence spoke again. "You know what the best part of today was?" Derek arched an eyebrow. "What?" Clarence smirked. "Watching him beg?" Derek burst out laughing. "All right, that was satisfying." Clarence chuckled too, shaking his head. But then his tone grew serious. "Listen, you handled that the right way. You let him dig his own grave, then buried him with his own words. You didn't yell, didn't lose your temper. You let the truth speak for itself." Derek nodded, letting the words settle. After a beat, Clarence added, "That's how you really teach people a lesson. Not by arguing, but by making them face the weight of their own mistakes." Derek thought about that as they turned onto the highway. "So, where to now?" Clarence grinned, stretching out his legs. "Someplace where the salesmen actually know how to do their jobs." Derek chuckled. "You got it, old man." As they drove off, the luxury dealership faded into the distance. Just another place that lost more than just money that day. Because respect? That's something money can't buy. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before people even knew who you were? Or seen someone treated unfairly just because they didn't look the part? It happens more than we think, and the only way to change it is to call it out when we see it. Treat people with respect, not because of what they have, but because of who they are. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's keep the conversation going, because at the end of the day, character matters more than status.